Well, a very good morning and welcome to this Atticus event with Simon Hoare. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you. I'm Peter Cardwell. I'm a senior counsel at Atticus and I'm also political editor of TalkRadio as well. Now, Simon Hoare, I'm delighted, is with us. He is not only the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee in Parliament, he's been there for nearly 4 years in the chair. He's also the Conservative MP for North Dorset. Simon, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Over the next hour or so, we're just going to have a chat about everything that's happening in Northern Ireland politics, especially in relation to what has happened with the Windsor Framework. And I want your questions as well. I have a list of questions here in front of me, but I really want questions from everybody watching this morning. And you can put that in the Zoom chat. And the top team behind the screen here are looking through those questions and we'll put them to me, and I have them on a screen here. So I'll give as many questions as we can possibly get through in the next hour to Simon. So Simon, really appreciate your time this morning. I know it's a busy parliamentary calendar at the moment, and you've come to the Atticus offices to do this, so we really, really appreciate that. I suppose the first thing I want to ask you is about the Windsor Framework. I mean, this is a major deal. There is some opposition to it, but not very much, especially here in Westminster. What do you make of it?
I think it's phenomenal. I think it's amazing what the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and the Northern Ireland Secretary collectively have been able to negotiate. And I think it demonstrates when serious people start to do politics seriously, then serious changes can be delivered. And I think the key ingredient for that was the restoration of trust and mutual respect. And I think when those two ingredients are in the mix, a lot of things can happen.
And it took a little while for that to happen.
Well, it did, because we were moving from an incredibly low baseline. And I think what the Prime Minister and the government have done is to slowly but surely rebuild that wall of trust between the UK and the European Union. I think we've done the same with Dublin. I think we're doing the same with Washington. And I happened to be talking to some German parliamentarians last week, and they said to me, it was great that the UK was back at the table, and it was the UK that they recognised, the UK that they respected, that they knew and trusted.
What's changed, do you think? I mean, obviously we've had a few changes of Prime Minister, and the person you supported, Rishi Sunak, is now Prime Minister. Has that made the difference?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, I think Rishi is a doer of deals. If you look at him, there's not an ideological bone in his body. He's a practical guy. He's a pragmatist to his fingertips. Here is a problem. What is a solution? How can we persuade people, convince people, negotiate with people in order to get to where it is that we wish to go? And you're right, that is a slow process. It can be very laborious, and it only suits that sort of doing of complex stuff, only suits a certain character. And I think Rishi's got that in spades. And there are a lot of people I've been talking to, both within Northern Ireland and over the way here in Westminster, who have just sort of said, how in the name of heaven did he achieve all that he has? We didn't think the European Union would give that. We didn't think that was possible. We always thought that was a red line. And I think there's a lot of people who are now looking, as a result of that, at Rishi Sunak as a Prime Minister who will quietly and soberly get on and deliver for this country. And after the
return of boring government, perhaps?
Well, I think it's a return of sensible UK statecraft, a mature democracy, a seat on the Security Council, lead player in NATO, head of the Commonwealth, finally, after a brief moment of eccentricity, returning to what the world looks to the UK to provide, which is stability, sobriety, and seriousness.
Let me ask you about those who disagree with the Windsor Framework, because there aren't that many in your own party. There are some within the ERG, the group who are skeptical, have always been.
Not that many, Peter.
Well, it's
I mean, if you listened to, let's say, for example, Ian Duncan Smith, Mark Francois, people that you would sort of define as sort of weather vanes on this sort of issue. Now, they weren't doing cartwheels.
Yeah.
But they weren't pouring cold water either.
The interesting thing I heard from the 1922 committee the next day, which presumably you were at, was that most of the discussion was about small boats. It wasn't about the Windsor Framework.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, both within Northern Ireland, in the rest of the UK, and indeed in the EU, want to move on, because there are bigger issues. And I think this is almost sort of helped in a way. If you look at, say, the horror story that is Ukraine at the moment. If you were looking for a silver lining in the cloud on that, I think it made everybody realize that there's more that unites us than divides us. We have a huge range of shared values and principles. And if the countries of the West couldn't find a solution that worked in practical political terms for 1.9 million people, that was probably a huge failure of statecraft, a victory for Putin. And frankly, we should all just, get off the stage and let somebody else have a go. So I think that of itself was a motivator. And you're right, small boats is clearly a big and dominant issue. We've just had the second reading of the migration bill yesterday. So I think people are saying, really surprised, pleasantly surprised at what the Prime Minister has been able to achieve. Let's now bag that, make it work, and move on. And I think in so doing, not only do you restore the relationship of mutual trust and respect, you open opportunities for, let's say, for example, Horizon, which will be of huge importance, notwithstanding the benefits of Turing. But if you look at Horizon, huge benefits there for collaborative research and everything else between our universities. And if you think the UK has got, 3 of the world's top 10 universities, according to last week's league table, we can really lead on this, and that will help power the economy in GB and, of course, in Northern Ireland.
So what's your message then to those? You say there's some in your party that weren't doing cartwheels, but there hasn't been a sustained opposition. There's no sense that the vote will be lost or anything like that when it comes. But the DUP are still deciding what they think. There are some, such as Sammy Wilson and Ian Paisley, for example. Ian Paisley made it clear within the ink was barely dry on the agreement where he said it didn't cut the mustard. 25 years ago...
Well, Ian's got form on that.
Right.
I think within about 36 hours of the UK leaving the European Union, when the sort of earlier bits of the protocol were in place, he was already calling for Article 16 to be triggered.
Right.
So I'm tempted to say that Ian possibly suffers from premature irritation.
Okay. In terms of 25 years ago and very soon, Queen's University is a big a series of events which President Biden now says he's coming to Northern Ireland to celebrate the 25 years since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. When that was about to be signed and when there were problems in that negotiation, I remember as a schoolboy, Tony Blair saying to Sinn Féin in particular, and to the unionist parties as well, the train is leaving the station here. You've got to get on. It's leaving whether you're getting on or not. Do you think the same can be said in regard to elements of the DUP, maybe not all of the DUP? Do you think actually the Windsor Framework is not what they want? Have they run out of road to mix the metaphor?
I think the government has been perfectly correct, and I support them in this. The DUP have asked for some time to closely consider and interrogate the documentation, what it means, analyze it against their 7 tests. And I think everybody has agreed, given the importance of the issues, given the desirability of securing cross-community support for anything in Northern Ireland, I think that still remains a noble objective. Then I think it's right for the DUP to have that space and time. But I think there are some things which, whilst respecting that, need to be pointed out. There is no appetite in Westminster, in Number 10, in Brussels, to reopen reopened negotiations. I think this is, by any honest assessment, this is the best that can be secured, and therefore it's either this being Windsor, or it's the protocol. It's one or the other. The necessity of the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, we parked that and it's gone, clearly wouldn't meet that key international test of necessity, because there are clearly other remedies, the other remedy being the Windsor Framework. Yeah. So the bill, which I didn't support in any event, but many colleagues did. Now, whether that helped as a leverage tool in order to get some of these changes to it, I don't know, and I don't think anybody will really know. But its necessity has disappeared. So the protocol bill is not a fallback position. That's gone. So in the world of realpolitik, I think it's Windsor, or it would be the protocol as originally drafted.
Yeah. Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK with access to both the UK and EU single markets. This is, some would argue, been a benefit, many businesses would argue, it's been a benefit to Northern Ireland since January 2020. I mean, are your constituents in North Dorset looking perhaps slightly enviously at Northern Ireland, thinking, hold on a second, you have more market access than we have?
Well, 2 points on that, if I may. The first is there was always going to be, there's always going to have to be a bespoke solution with regards to the delivery of Brexit, given the fact that Northern Ireland is the only bit of the UK with a land border with the European Union. So I think that's the first point to make. The second is, and many politicians, including sort of senior unionists, right at the start said, this is a golden opportunity. You know probably better than me that the need to turbo drive the prosperity side of the Good Friday Agreement coin, the other side being the peace dividend, is still there, because we have to make sure that all communities in Northern Ireland are feeling the benefit of that.
So but also a huge reliance on the public sector.
Huge reliance on the public sector. But here is an opportunity. It'd be great when President Biden comes, if he brings a couple of sort of, investors with him as well. That usually happens on these sorts of things. So
but if your government is going to put up corporation tax from 19% to 25% in the pound and south of the border, it's still much lower than that. I mean, that's going to be problematic, is it not?
Well, I don't think it will, because I think I think investors look for other things apart from. I mean, tax rates are clearly part of the mix of decision making. I think people recognise that this is probably a temporary phenomenon in order to address the black hole created by funding of COVID and other initiatives the government has had to have. But investors look for other things as well. They look for a motivated workforce. They look for political stability. They look for a country where the rule of law, where international agreements and everything else is maintained and guaranteed. So there's lots of things in the mix, I think, that when viewed in the round, people will still say, we want to come to the United Kingdom, all parts of the United Kingdom, because it is the United Kingdom. It has a track record. It's got a lot of skills. It's got a flexible economy. It's got a buoyant workforce. How can we tap into that to make our own businesses grow?
Just a reminder that we're talking to Simon Hoare here. This is an Atticus event. I'm Peter Cardwell, and you can certainly put your questions to Simon if you want to in the chat box of the Zoom that we're on at the moment, and the team will feed them through to me. Maybe I could just ask you another one, actually. Just, you mentioned, we touched a little bit on the Republic there. If we look back to sort of 2011 and the Queen's visit to Ireland, to me anyway, in the history of the Irish state, that was probably the high watermark of those relations. That has been severely tested in the last decade, certainly since Brexit. What do you think? Do you think this is the beginning of the end of the beginning in terms of those bad relations? Do you think things will get better? Think things will get back on an even keel between the UK and Ireland?
I do. I mean, I think you're right to highlight the late Queen's visit, because the symbolism of that was beyond calculation.
Yeah.
Let's be frank. Yeah. We then went through a very difficult time. And I'm tempted to say the next big thing in that relationship, which helped with the restoration of normal and improving relations, was the Baker apologia, where Steve at I think it was a BIPA event, it might have been an IGC, sort of said, I am sorry, because we haven't really treated the Republic with the respect that it needed during this Brexit process. That really hit home because it was sincere. Those weren't words parroted by somebody who sort of drafted it in the back room and said, Minister, you've got to read this into the record. That was from the heart. And I think that, talking to my Irish friends, that had a huge impact. Because I think
Brexit hard man Steve Baker was certainly seen as a bit of a boogeyman for many people in Ireland.
Not just in Ireland, by many. But I mean, the work that Steve is doing as a Minister of State, a job that he in the NIO, a job which he enjoys, and I think is doing superbly well. I mean, he is talking to all of the communities. He's making relationships. He's forging better dialogues, and is doing a fantastic job. Now, I'm not just saying this as one Conservative MP about another. If I thought he was doing a rotten job, you know me well enough, and Steve
Yeah,
knows me
you,
well
you
enough
would say it.
that I would say. But I think he and Chris are doing phenomenally
Two very strong Brexiteers, so that helps.
well. Indeed, yeah. and I think that also helps underscore the benefits that are contained within the Windsor Framework. If two former chairs of the European Research Group say this meets our tests, then I think that should be good enough for anybody. It's like it's almost like the the Holy Father saying, "Oh well, that's not quite Catholic enough for me." If they say Windsor is fine, I think it's fine. But going back to your question about Anglo-Irish relations, I think there is clearly I keep going back to these terms because I think they're so important. This mutual respect, this cordial friendship, this trust, this politeness, which now exists between Westminster and Dublin, where we both see ourselves as dealing with equals, with equal voices and equal views, I think is hugely important. I think it's appreciated by both societies, and that provides the foundation stone from which other things can spring, because it's in nobody's interest, given the geographic proximity of our islands, for there to be a permafrost between the Republic and the UK.
Yes, it's interesting to mention this because not only in terms of within Northern Ireland itself and the UK-Ireland relations, but maybe we could talk a little bit about the census, which I know is something that your select committee addressed recently, because it's something that's sort of quite difficult to actually explain to an English audience, perhaps, that may not get the nuances. But when people think of Northern Ireland, they tend to think of unionist nationalists, and then there'll be a few people in the middle. Yeah. But actually, the few people in the middle is becoming almost as large a group as unionists or nationalists. And in terms of something like a border poll, this would be something that would be, this group of others, this people who are neither unionist nor nationalist, has become really, really important, has it not?
Yes, and I don't actually think it's that hard for anybody in GB to understand. Look out of your front door, look around your communities. The country is changing. Nothing stays. You should never want anything to sort of stay preserved in some sort of, cultural aspect. Things change and evolve. Northern Ireland is Northern Ireland is no different to any other part of the United Kingdom, or indeed any other European country. Things are changing. The census, I thought, was interesting because there is a small but growing community of those who weren't born in the UK, now living and working in Northern Ireland, some by choice, some by necessity because they have come from Syria or elsewhere. And they're now putting down roots and making their lives in Northern Ireland. And then you just have this generational change where the fixity of politics is less fixed. There are now fewer and fewer cradle-to-grave Labour or cradle-to-grave Tories or cradle-to-grave Liberals. People will change between election and election. The old tribal loyalties, the old tribal ties, I can't vote that because my grandmother would spin in her grave or my grandfather will come down and shout at me. I think all of that's gone, or certainly, there's a tiny, tiny rump of it. What are people going to be voting for? They're going to be voting for parties which say what they're in favour of and what they support. They're going to be voting for parties which improve educational output, health output, the local economy, infrastructure. And there is going to be, as we are seeing, I would suggest, across the whole of the UK, far greater fluidity amongst the electorate. Now, you can either stand and rail against that, and one side or both sides can blow their whistle and the pack comes running, or you can say, we've got to change, we've got to face into modernity, we've got to meet the needs of the electorate. And I think the impasse with Stormont not sitting at the moment is beginning to ask a question in many, many people's minds across the communities. Are these people interested in public service, or is it all about party advantage and self-service? Those are questions which are legitimate questions from the electorate to those they elect.
I think it is, and speaking to friends in Northern Ireland as well, I think they would say, perhaps what's more important, the rule of the ECJ or getting my hip replacement.
Well, I think that's right.
When Stormont's back.
Well, as a committee, we've been talking to businesses and business organisations for the last 2.5 years about protocol and post-EU membership and all that. Not a single organisation has said, do you know what's keeping me awake of an evening is the thought of going to the ECJ, because when the ECJ has to get involved in their role,
it's rare, isn't it?
Well, it is so rare. It is so rare, and things that would obviously have got to such a sticky impasse where the joint committee or other forms of negotiation would have failed. It really is it's the adjudicatory equivalent, I suppose, of the nuclear option. So I think those who are trying to blow this up as some sort of, evil power.
But still, I mean, there will be those who will have sympathy with Ian Paisley, with Sammy Wilson, with Jim Allister, who say, well, this is, we as a country voted for Brexit, and we still have European jurisdiction in a part of the United Kingdom. That is true.
It is, but you don't hear it, and that's a perfectly, respectable position to take. But we would have to abide by adjudication of the World Trade Organization, not a British institution headquartered in London.
We didn't vote out of it, though.
We didn't vote out of it. But if one is prepared to accept, for advantages of trade and other reasons, the arbitration of something which isn't headquartered on our own soil, in one respect, we pool a different issue, but we pool our sovereignty with no complaint with regards to sovereignty. We can, with regards to NATO, we combine quite a lot of our sovereignty with regards to the Security Council, recognizing that collective action is better than individual. I think most people now realize that we're living in a multidimensional, interconnected, far more international world. And those who just say, oh, well, unless it's got the Union flag stamped on it, unless it's got made in the UK, there must be something suspicious and wrong about it. I understand why they think that. I just don't happen to agree with it or support it.
Let me go to a couple of questions that people have submitted through the chat function of Zoom. You can do that as well to Simon. We're here until 10:30, and I'll put as many of those questions as I possibly can to him, as well as some of my own as well. This has come in. You mentioned about unionist politicians recognizing the necessity of a bespoke solution, but has the pressure of the TUV, we mentioned Jim Allister earlier, and the languishing of the Ulster Unionist Party in the polls changed that political equation, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the TUV was probably the most strident anti-protocol party at the last Stormont elections, and they managed to get one MLA elected. They managed to get one MLA elected the time before. So I don't.
But all the elected unionists in both Belfast and Westminster were against the protocol, it's fair to say.
Exactly, but there were gradations of opposition, if you will. I'm tempted to say it probably speaks to a larger question, which is, does political unionism wish to marshal its effectiveness to the max? And I think that then moves you on to a question, which is, can political unionism sustain three competing political parties who will often get into the People's Popular Front of Judea and the People's, that sort of Monty Python thing.
Yes.
I'm more unionist than you are, or if you say that, you're a Lundy, etc. I don't think that does unionism any good at all. And I think there is time for a serious grown-up debate, and possibly the window of opportunity, if we were able to move past Windsor, now presents itself for the leaders of political unionism to come together and say, why don't we have a shared narrative of what inspires us about politics, what we want to achieve?
Would you advocate a merger?
Well, a merger, a new party, I don't know. I mean, my party, the Conservative Party, after the 1997 general election rout, we spent the next few years telling everybody what we were opposed to, and what made us annoyed, and what made us angry, and what we'd stop, and what we'd overturn. And the electorate, when we asked them the question, are you thinking what we're thinking, turned around and said, no, we're not. And if you bothered to talk to us, you would have realised that. But I think unionism needs a sort of David Cameron type figure who can inspire, who can grasp the imagination of a younger generation.
Does that person exist?
Look, I think yes. I think yes. I can think of one or two people who could do that and would do it well. I think it would be a death knell of their career if I was to say, oh, it's got to be so.
Well, that's my next question. Can you share your thoughts on that?
It's got to be so. It may be that there's somebody that we don't know of at the moment who's just sort of new and fresh.
I mean, it's interesting because there was a party, a very small party called NI21 that set up with was meant to be a sort of liberal unionist party, and it died very, very quickly and fell apart. So perhaps that would be an argument against what you're advocating.
Well, it's very difficult in our system for new parties to start up and really get a sort of toehold and put down deep roots. I think.
What about the Conservatives in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think actually the Conservatives, and of course you've got to remember that it's, we are a unionist party, socially liberal, I'm tempted to say, modern in outlook, not all, but in broad terms. I would love to see the Northern Ireland Conservative Party do a whole lot better. I would actually like to see the Labour Party stand Labour Party candidates rather than the sister party relationship which they have with the SDLP.
Banned from standing candidates in Northern Ireland. Yeah.
Because if you are a unionist, and we go back, lots of people will quote Mrs. Thatcher's phrase, I want, Belfast is as British as Finchley. Exactly. Yeah. Well,
do you think it is?
In some respects, yes, but Cardiff isn't as, North Dorset isn't as British as Finchley, because one of our great strengths, I think, and I think as a unionist, this is something I always want to try and stress to people, is you don't have to be uniform to be a unionist. And that as British as Finchley sort of suggests that there is a rather a sort of opaque Magnolia type similarity between everything. One of the great strengths of our UK, I think, are our differences: culture, language, literature, geography, political traditions, all the rest of it. It's the strength, it's the underpinning of our shared values that draws us together. And I think if we started celebrating more of that, and I think an NI Conservative Party could do that well. And if as a unionist, why is it that voters in Northern Ireland are deprived of the right to vote for not deprived of, because we do stand some candidates, but it has been sort of slightly hit and miss in recent years, Labour Party none. I would love to see them being able to send a member of Parliament to Westminster who had a chance of being part of the party which was the party of the Prime Minister.
Yeah. They're very far away from that at the moment. There was one candidate a few years ago who got 27 votes, which was lower than the woman who wanted to criminalise sex outside marriage.
Yes. Which is a topic, Peter, I'm not going to get onto.
Slightly reminds me of that Henry Kissinger phrase that the war of the sexes will never be won because there's just too much fraternising with the enemy.
Precisely, and I'm going to steer clear of that, as tempting as it is to go down that rabbit hole. But I think they haven't been able to do as well because there's been that multiplicity of choice available. And I would, as I say, I would like to see, because if you look at the census, if you look at the demographics, if you look at the rise of the alliance, which is clearly not just fishing in a soft nationalism.
No, absolutely not.
They are hoovering up moderate unionist voters who want progressive, engaged politics and who are really turned off by, or certainly not turned on by, right, it's election time, are you us or are you them?
Yeah.
And we might not be great, but vote for us because we're not them, or vote for the other. That's no way, in a very complex, social media dominated, growing needs and expectation of what the state in all of its forms can deliver. There's no way to be doing politics.
Well, it's interesting you mention that, actually, because I want to talk a bit about nationalism and republicanism, because one of the part of the speculation in terms of the DUP not wanting to be in an executive in Northern Ireland is because they would have to take up for the first time the position of Deputy First Minister. And what many people don't know, including in Northern Ireland, is that First and Deputy First Minister is a co-equal office. We have a question in here questions are coming in thick and fast, by the way, and if you want to continue putting your questions in, put them in the chat function on Zoom, and I'll put as many as I can to Simon. Let me take this one. Though we can hope we have an agreed basis for a workable Northern Ireland, stress the hope, what does the prospect of a Sinn Féin government in Dublin, and Sinn Féin being the largest party in Northern Ireland currently, do for the strained political situation, says this person?
Well, I'm a Democrat. And you have to work with the democratically elected government and political leaders of the day, which their electorates have chosen. It's not for me to second guess that. As I always say to my kids when we're playing cards, you've got to play the hand of cards you're dealt rather than the hand of cards you would have liked, because otherwise we'd all have the 4 aces and 4 kings and everything else, and that would never really be fair. So it will be interesting to see what happens south of the border. The 2 traditional parties, if you want to put it that way, in the Republic are clearly very anxious about Sinn Féin for all sorts of reasons. Sinn Féin is obviously really keen to demonstrate its governance bona fides by becoming First Minister. I think Westminster missed a trick. We had an opportunity to accept an amendment which would have created joint First Minister,
which Sinn Féin have been advocating for a long time.
Look, one can't go to the loo without the other one saying, yes, you can. Yes. They can't do anything, which I think is something which is not readily understood.
Well, and actually the slight fog around this might be quite a technical point, but for years, the DUP, for example, said, vote DUP so you don't get Martin McGuinness as First Minister. But Martin McGuinness was Deputy First Minister, which was an equal role to First Minister, and they can't really go back and then say, well, no, this doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly. But I think for those whoever presume in any political party, a line of uninterruptible consistency on an issue.
Yes, indeed.
We all have to respond to events. I think we have to remind ourselves that the Good Friday Agreement is the base pad, but of a process. It wasn't a freestanding in isolation.
Is it still fit for purpose, do you think, 25 years on?
Yes, of course it is, because I think the first thing we have to always remember when we talk about that, because you think 25 years, you've got to think of the bravery of people, John Major, Paddy Mayhew, Albert Reynolds, Bernie Ahern, Paisley, McGuinness, Adams, et al., who looked at the electorate and said, the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue. We have to show political bravery. We have to show political leadership. We have to make the weather. We have to, because we have it within us, to deliver change.
It took Paisley a while to get on board, though. He voted against it.
And then, but then look at the fantastic relation. Well, they're the Chuckle Brothers,
That's right.
The fantastic relationship. Because at the end of the day, I think anybody who gets into the practice of politics, what strikes you squarely between the eyes regularly is that all of us go into politics to try to make things better, to try to make things more comfortable for people to be happier with their lifestyles and all the rest of it. Nobody goes into politics to make things worse. So you have that shared endeavor. Now you will have different route maps, how you get from A to B, but broadly we all want to get to the same destination in terms of socioeconomic reform and improvements and all the rest of it. And I think that was writ large. The interesting thing I think we found about, as a committee we're undertaking an inquiry, I think both Bertie and John Major have indicated that their thought is, if the world of social media had existed, actually the delivery of the Good Friday Agreement might have been impossible. Because we all know that the echo chamber of one's own supporters, cohort, tribe, call it what you will pull people back. And I think now is a time, it is a process. We need to focus on the political stability, because from political stability will flourish further economic development, predicated on the maintenance of peace. And we should never take lightly the advantage that the peace dividend provides. I think I'm right to say that the call that the Chief Constable of the PSNI had to say one of your officers has been shot, John Cardwell, a few weeks ago now, was the first call that the Chief Constable had taken of that nature. Now you go and talk to previous Chief Constables of the RUC.
Almost every day.
It was a daily and certainly a weekly occurrence. And I think that one fact, if you will, and we do take things for granted, don't we? If you live in a beautiful area and you see it every day, it's only when a visitor comes and goes, gosh, don't you live in a beautiful area? Then it suddenly reminds yourself. I think the Good Friday Agreement and the 25th anniversary allows us to reflect on the horrors of the past and the hope of the now and the future. And if I had one wish, this silver anniversary year of the Good Friday Agreement, I think every school child everywhere in the United Kingdom should be forced to watch the last episode of Derry Girls, because that montage of the horror and the excitement on those faces, those young faces, and the older generation knowing this was last chance saloon for change, that it showed on referendum day and when the result came through. I think it's an incredibly moving piece of social commentary through television, but it stands an absolute monument to the bravery of those political leaders who helped deliver that.
You're a big fan of Derry Girls, aren't you?
Huge.
Do you identify with the wee English fella? Is that
no? I think who do I identify with? I think I probably have the sort of slightly sardonic eye-rolling, eyebrow-raising of the nun.
Sister Michael.
Yes, exactly.
We've all been there at points, haven't we? Yeah.
I think we have. I mean, I went
certainly in Northern Ireland politics.
I went to a Catholic primary school where we had nuns. One or two would raise their eyebrows in exactly that way,
and the message would be clear.
They didn't have to say anything.
Yes,
they didn't have to say anything. It was just that. Look.
Let's go to some more questions. We're just about halfway through this webcast with Simon Hoare, the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee and Conservative MP for North Dorset. And if you want to put your questions in, just put them in the chat function of the Zoom. A couple more questions here. Is the Northern Ireland office putting sufficient pressure on the DUP to restore the executive? What are they doing right, and what more can they do to bring government back to Northern Ireland?
Well, I'm not sure that pressuring would be hugely useful, but I think the clarity of what the NIO has said is hugely helpful. The first is that they have ruled out joint authority. The second, and possibly the most important, is that they have ruled out direct rule.
Yeah.
So it's devolution working or devolution not, but it's devolution. And so it's up to local politicians whether they want to.
But how long can that go on, Simon? Because if you're in a situation where you have Stormont suspended for a long time, you have the civil servants who often have their hands tied in terms of what they can do. Certainly, judicial review on that recently. I mean, that is a form of pressure in itself, is it not?
I hope it is. But I think the greatest pressure is not Chris Heaton-Harris or Steve Baker or the Prime Minister, or to a much lower rung, me or anybody else. I think it's the electorate, where the electorate are going to start, well, they have started saying, we need stuff being done in the health service. We need stuff being done in education, in infrastructure, in a post-COVID, energy insecure world, all of those sorts of things. Now, I raised this in the House of Commons, and Sammy Wilson sort of intervened and said, and perfectly properly, Stormont can't solve all of these problems. And he's right. But they can jolly well find some solutions to some of them. Yeah. And all because you can't fix all by yourself doesn't mean you shouldn't have a go and achieve in those areas where you can. And I think there will be people, irrespective of how or indeed if they've ever voted, will be saying, why stand for election when you don't want to serve? And why do? And I think the next question, which I think actually should be of the greatest impetus, if you will, is why have we got a system where one party can just leave the field of play and the match has to stop? I can't really think of any legislature worthy of the name where that can happen.
So should the institutions be reformed?
Well,
you said the Good Friday Agreement is fit for purpose, but now perhaps you're advocating change? Well,
no, I think it's fit for purpose because it's fit for purpose as the foundation stone. But it's an evolutionary process. We've had Stormont House, we've had New Decade New Approach, we've had St Andrews. I think the Secretary of State has been abundantly clear that he will respond to calls for change from the grassroots of Northern Ireland. It's not going to be a top-down change. I can't see Dublin wishing to oppose that. I can't see Washington wishing to oppose that. So I think that the route map is set, which is either resurrect yourselves and get going again, or the institution will be resurrected, but maybe with a different rubric with regards to the formulation of the executive. And I think the longer this goes on, the worse life will be for people, and very often the people who can least afford it.
Do you think there's any prospect of Stormont coming back before the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Agreement? We've got a month to go.
Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if it did?
A nice optimistic note.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if it did? If they said, look, there are some outstanding issues here. And I think I would encourage all of the politicians to focus on delivering on the election result for Stormont and not worrying about the local elections. The local elections should not be, will not be, and cannot be a referendum on whether the Good Friday Agreement is a good thing or a bad thing, or whether Windsor is good or bad or whatever. That's local elections. I was a local councillor for 12 years to elect local politicians to deliver local services. This is about the delivery of broad, strategic, life-changing and enhancing public policy, delivered perfectly properly through Stormont. We have to move away from Northern Irish exceptionalism. Oh, well, these things always happen, so we have to be a bit more patient. We have to have a bit of pressure to say, come on, get on and serve.
Actually, this leads me to another question that someone has submitted online, which is really coming back a little bit to the Windsor Framework about the Stormont break, which is something we've heard a lot about, but I'm interested to hear your view on it. This person has written, once the Stormont break is triggered, the UK government must judge MLA's explanation that the break has been triggered appropriately. How far will it get that far? How will this work in practice?
I'm tempted to say if the break is required, that would almost be a failure of negotiation and conversation. And I think plugging the democratic deficit gap, which the EU clearly wants to do by finding mechanisms to engage with Northern Irish politicians, business leaders, business organisations, as new rules apply, I think is a very good indication going forward. I think it's right to have the assessment hurdle, if you will, because I think people would be rather reluctant if the I can't quite remember the words that the officiating minister uses at a wedding, but it's not to be entered into frivolously, but soberly and with due consideration. So it's perfectly proper that somebody evaluates, is this a legitimate application of the break, or is it a vexatious one, which is why you need to have the 30 MLAs from at least two parties supporting it, and there have to be, just as you would an application through judicial review, for example, you would have to set out your reasons as to why you think this would need to be delivered. The important thing there is that the systems are in place in Westminster to undertake a very speedy review of the case in order to either dismiss or support.
Are you confident in that process?
I am. I mean, we've got a big civil service, we've got a very mature democracy and way of doing these things. I think that's probably the easiest bit of the jigsaw to find it slothful.
Believe it or not, we are 3/4 of the way through this conversation.
I've only just cleared my throat, Peter. I would describe those as opening remarks.
So if you do want to get some final questions in, do submit them on the Zoom chat function. We have another one here, actually, from someone who says, a Belfast Telegraph Lucid Talk poll showed 2/3 of people in Northern Ireland back the new deal on the Windsor Framework. However, 73% of DUP supporters in that poll would vote against it in a referendum. Surely the game has changed for those who want a workable Northern Ireland, this person says. It seems to be unionism standing in the way.
Well, look, we can spend a lot of time batting backwards and forwards. I think the key thing I'd say is that neither tradition has the whip hand on this. And at some point, all politicians have to say, look, in the ideal world, I might like X, but practical politics dictates Y, and Y is supported by a whole range of business. Go back to what Jeffrey, Arlene, and others were saying, not that long ago. Think of the benefits that one foot in both camps in the internal market of the United Kingdom and in the single market of the European Union can have for an area of the United Kingdom which we know has had very distinct socioeconomic problems, in huge part due to decades of troubles and fragmentation. Let's focus on moving that forward so then people can see the benefits. And very often, that phrase, one has nothing to fear but fear itself. Some of these things do require a leap into the dark. The whole Good Friday process was in essence that, was it going to work out? Was somebody going to rat on it? Was it all going to collapse? Was somebody going to be left with egg on their face? But people responded to the broad electorate that said status quo, no, progress and change, risk, yes, challenge, of course, optimism, buckets of, let's make this work. I think it's a peculiar fate of history, a turn of history, is it, that we're 25 years on, faced with precisely the same challenges for politicians as we were 25 years ago. Let optimism and hope and goodwill triumph. And I
let sunshine win the day.
Let sunshine win the day. Let sunshine win the day. And then the dividends will be felt. And then younger people will want to stay in Northern Ireland rather than going elsewhere to make their homes and their lives. It's a sadness, is it not, that when youngsters leave Northern Ireland to go to university in GB, only a very small percentage go back. And we've got to start asking ourselves, and local politicians have to start asking themselves, why? Let's address the why.
I want to ask a question. You mentioned John Caldwell, DCI John Caldwell, who was shot, and we of course send our very best wishes to him and his family. Parliamentary violence continues to be not nearly as big an issue, but an issue nonetheless in Northern Ireland. I know your select committee has looked into that. It feeds in, of course, to organised crime as well. What has your committee been looking into in regard to that? What are your conclusions?
Well, we haven't concluded the inquiry yet. It is ongoing. But a number of things which I will try and bullet point. First of all, it's to face into and face down this exceptionalism narrative. Well, it's Northern Ireland. We've always had these sorts of things. We've just got to sort of live around it.
Well, it was interesting actually. Someone said to me in the newsroom I work in, if a policeman had been shot in Manchester or Birmingham, there would have been a lot more in the news about it.
So first of all, we've got to get rid of that. Number one. Number two, we have to start calling these people out for what they are and what they do. A man who inserts by force a package of drugs anally into a teenage boy to move from one part of a city to the other is not just a drug dealer, he's a child abuser. And it's either a serious sexual crime or it's rape. But it's not part of the picture. Those who issue these so-called punishment beatings, they have no right to administer punishment. These are thuggish intimidations. Those who are preying on vulnerable young women hardest hit by the cost of living crisis, who are being cajoled into taking out loans to be repaid at some unsustainable rate of interest, which we're then hearing is either being paid back through sexual favours, entering prostitution, offering their children up to be drug runners as a way of paying off some of the debt, hiding a cache of drugs or guns or whatever in their home. This would not be acceptable in North Dorset. My constituents would be up in arms. This is not part of how society functions. These are safeguarding issues that we're talking about. And we've got to strip off these thugs their flags of convenience. The flag of, well, we're helping to keep, Dublin and the Catholic Church away, or, well, we're doing this to try and drive the Brits out. This is not a political struggle. These are small men trying to act big, feasting off the souls and entrails of ordinary folk in Northern Ireland who deserve a whole lot better. So we need a really robust refocusing from policing and intelligence and others. There will be a whole raft, I'm sure, of recommendations within the committee report, and I don't want to preempt those. But we have to change the narrative that these people are the faux military structures, that they're serving some purpose. They are social terrorists. They are child abusers. They are intimidators. They are thugs. And if we are able to move the prison population away from prisoner segregation, which is, as you know, occurring, then I think we all know how prisoners in the estate deal with or approach or liaise with those other prisoners who are there on child abuse, safeguarding issues. Let's recalibrate the words that we use and the narrative of description that we apply to these people. They are a scourge, they are thugs. What I found dispiriting, I was on the Nolan show last week, we were discussing this. I had used the phrase when we had the Secretary of State before us at committee. And if I sound passionate about this, Peter, I am, because I am horrified. And I think the whole committee has been moved with the testimony that we've heard both in public and, I suppose, actually more importantly, in private session. I called for the annihilation of these groups. And there was a bit of kickback from that. And I don't think there should be a question mark over why I use that word annihilation. There should be question marks over the motivations of those who were kicking back, who were trying to defend the indefensible. Now, I salute those who have made the transition. And there's some great role models in both communities and fantastic community workers who are striving day in, day out to make sure that young people don't go down the wrong road. But 25 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, I think the transitioning period has got to be drawn to a close. You've had the window of opportunity to transition is closing. Transition now or face the full weight of the law, because this behaviour will not and cannot be tolerated. I say that as a unionist. Why should people, particularly those most vulnerable in society, why should they have a disproportionate burden of suffering than people in my constituency or elsewhere in GB? It is intolerable and it has got to stop. We've got to stop the glorification. We've got to stop the faux militaristic language. We have got to come down on them like a ton of bricks. I hate them.
Very clear, very clear. You talked a little bit in that about some of the challenges that people were facing because of the cost of living. COVID and lockdown, of course, for Northern Ireland as well as the rest of the United Kingdom has had a big effect. The nightclub industries are very big in Northern Ireland, certainly around Belfast, and tourism is a big thing. I mean, in terms of bouncing back from COVID and coming back from COVID, you said you don't want to talk about a Northern Irish exceptionalism, essentially, but should there be greater support? Is Northern Ireland emerging from that well? Are you happy with that? Or is there more that could be done?
Most of the data is pointing in the right direction, and that's to be encouraged. I think Westminster has, with Jeremy Hunt, managed to restore sort of financial stability and international respect for how we're dealing with these matters. And I think that's good for the whole of the United Kingdom. I go back to a point that we were discussing a few minutes ago, which is what is really going to make the difference is the restoration of Stormont. That's the piece of the jigsaw, which I would suggest is probably the most important, because you then have elected politicians instructing officials in real time to find solutions to problems as they present themselves, rather than, as you alluded to a little while ago, hardworking civil servants who are committed to making people's lives better, but who are effectively cocooned in the policies of yesteryear because there's nobody to refresh and create. And the world, if you think about it, post-COVID, with Ukraine, is entirely different to how it was back at 2019.
Yeah,
entirely different.
In terms of Northern Ireland itself, in terms of the priorities that people have rather than Stormont itself, I wonder whether you think there is a trajectory, whether there is a chance of a border pool in the next while, even in the next, maybe not in the next year, but certainly in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think that will happen? Do you think that's something that, presumably as a unionist, you don't think that's something that's desirable? Presumably as a unionist, you don't think that's something that would be won by those who want a united Ireland, but do you think it will happen?
I don't think within the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, it's a question most probably asked to the Secretary of State, because
he or she is the one to decide.
Well, yeah, because the legislation is so opaque. It's to be judged by criteria assessed by the Secretary, but nobody knows what the criteria
There've been numerous freedom of information requests and so on, and
precisely.
And
I think it doesn't actually exist. I think this may not be the most elegant metaphor, but we've all taken something out of the fridge, haven't we? And it's still in its sort of, cellophane or whatever, but you look at it and you go, it's past, no, that's going out. There are certain things in life when you just instinctively know that it's the time for something. It's the time to change something, time to replace something, whatever. And I'm tempted to say that the criteria will somehow or another manifest themselves in a way that suddenly wakes up and goes, I think that there's a very cogent argument here that would say we have to test the union in a poll. I have every confidence that if political unionism effectively faces into the challenges that we've been talking about, and in a manner which I've suggested I think would be helpful to them to do so, and therefore by definition helpful to the integrity of the United Kingdom, I am confident that the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland would vote for the maintenance of the Union. Clearly, I think people would need to have somehow a more detailed sketched out what would a reunified Ireland look like, how would the legal system work, how would health work, how would benefits work, etc. And we often know, as we saw in the Scottish referendum, for example, when you drill into that detail, rather than just the so-called, big picture, simple question, people start going, well, not certain about that, or is it better the devil you know, sort of thing. But we have to make this positive case. And I think one of the changes that I'd like to see in the narrative of unionism is that there is a question which I think the electorate is asking, or some in the electorate will ask, which is not a rhetorical question. If the unionist position is, Westminster doesn't understand us, Westminster always shafts us, Westminster always tucks us up, Westminster always betrays us, Westminster always lets us down, Westminster's not interested. Well, the next question by definition has to be, so why do you want to remain part of Westminster? So I think that there has to be a certain amount of care and attention on that. And as I said, start to sculpt out a unified, progressive, positive, optimistic, unionist narrative. I think Sinn Féin have done it on their side of the coin. Political Sinn Féin is now hugely different to what you and I will remember as, sort of teenagers and youngsters advocating for things which one would have thought impossible for them to advocate for. And, politicians have to change as people change. Otherwise, we just get, washed away.
We have literally 2 minutes left, and I'm going to end with a terrible confession, Simon, that when I was 13 years old, there was a test for the children in my class.
Oh, no.
And I'm not going to test you, don't worry. The test was to do a 5-minute talk on an issue, or any issue you wanted to talk about. And most people talked about, their pets, or they talked about their football club. One guy actually did a very good discussion on the history of the World Cup and the Jules Rimet trophy. Now, I did the Belfast Agreement and why it matters to you as a 13-year-old.
Well, I salute you.
I was incredibly geeky even then. Now, if there's a 13-year-old perhaps watching this or watching a repeat of this because they're at school,
I don't know if my 13-year-old daughter is, but I can think of a 13-year-old.
If there is a 13-year-old watching this, what would you say? I mean, the 25 years that I've seen the celebration of the Belfast Agreement and all the political progress, despite the setbacks, if there's a 13-year-old watching this and you've got to say, right, in the next 25 years when we have the golden anniversary of the Belfast Agreement, what are your hopes for Northern Ireland? What do you hope Northern Ireland will look like in another 25 years' time?
It's still part of the United Kingdom. That the restoration of Stormont 2023 was the last time we ever had to talk about the restoration of Stormont. That unemployment is hugely low, that life chances have improved, that people feel happier with their neighbours, that we have seen significant progress in the integration of education, and I suppose that people are happy and content with the politicians that they've got, what their politicians are doing and achieving, and that the ancient ties and bonds have been loosened to the point of invisibility, that people have moved on and embraced the opportunities of peace, never forgetting, and I hope that maybe in 25 years' time they're still showing the final episode of Derry Girls, or at least a compilation of some of the horror footage that you and I remember from the Troubles, to say that's how it was, this is how it is, we can only go forward, we should never go back.
Simon Hoare, thank you very, very much. I think it was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you to Simon, who is, of course, the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee and the Conservative MP for North Dorset. I'm Peter Cardwell. I'd like to thank everyone who's watching, and indeed everyone here at Atticus as well, behind the scenes, who set this up and been involved in the production of today. Thank you so much for watching. We'll have another one of these again very soon.